Okay, good afternoon, everybody. We just had a few technical difficulties, but the panel will be joining us here in just a moment. So as a reminder, while we're waiting for the panelists to join, I'll just remind people to please feel free to use the chat function to make comments and engage with your fellow peers in the audience. Please use the Q&A tab to put questions that you would like us to utilize when we get to the Q&A part of this discussion around 3 p.m. And you are also able to upvote questions that you really want to make sure that we see and ask our panelists. Okay. Let's see, Stacy and Ted, I think we're still just waiting for Julie to join and to remove the hold slide, please. Okay, and okay, well, while we're waiting for Julie Gerberdine, and if I could ask the BioStaff just to put in chat to give me any updates on if we're able to have her join this session. But while we're waiting, why don't I just go ahead and start with some introductions. Again, welcome everyone. This is the Social and Business Imperative of Clinical Trial Diversity panel. I'm going to do quick introductions. We have Stacy Hargraves on the panel. Stacy is the Vice President of R&D Portfolio Management for Janssen, the pharmaceutical company of Johnson & Johnson. Stacy's an active member in several professional and community-based organizations, including the National Coalition of 100 Black Women. And she's also currently the executive sponsor for Janssen's diversity in clinical trial efforts. We have Dr. Ted Love, who is a biopharmaceutical industry leader with more than 20 years of broad management experience, supported by nearly a decade of providing clinical care as a practicing physician. And he is currently the CEO of Global Blood Therapeutics and the current chair of Bio's board. Hopefully, we're able to work through our technical difficulties, and we'll shortly be joined by Dr. Julie Gerberdine. Dr. Gerberdine is the Executive Vice President and Chief Patient Officer at Merck, where she is responsible for global public policy, communications, patient engagement, and corporate social responsibility, among many other functions. Prior to joining Merck, she was the director of the CDC, where she led the agency through SARS and over 40 emergency responses to public health crises, and is the current associate vice chair of Bio's board. We expect Julie to be able to join us at least via audio sound. Is Julie on? And again, I'll ask Bio staff to post in the chat so I can have an update there, please. Okay, well, while we continue to work through that, and again, it's just not the virtual world without a virtual hiccup, right? So why don't we soldier on and go ahead and get the conversation started. So, first I want to thank the panelists for taking time to have this discussion here with our audience today. And I'd like to comment on the fact that we're honored to have such executive leadership represented on this panel. This is a great illustration of how medical, patient, diversity, and scientific expertise are valued and embraced at the highest echelons of our industry. And we're here today to discuss, as is mentioned in the title, the social and business imperative of clinical trial diversity. It's the goal of this summit and for Bio to really provide this opportunity for leaders such as yourself to share insights and information that can help the entire ecosystem think about how to implement strategies that will help us, hopefully at long last, achieve the goal of an equitable healthcare system. And two key objectives necessary to realizing that goal are, one, to increase diverse participation in clinical trials, and 2, to increase our understanding of health outcomes across all gender, race, geographies, and social economic patient populations. And so, Ted, I thought this would be great to sort of kick off with you, particularly given your company's experience working to treat sickle cell disease. It's a disease that affects approximately 100,000 Americans, with the vast majority of those impacted being part of minority communities, particularly those of African descent. And so I think it'd be really nice to sort of kick off this whole conversation with, what did you learn, and what was your approach to find and engage your patient community, the sickle cell patient community, when you were developing your clinical trials? Ted?
First of all, thanks, Carter, for the invitation to be here. I've thought a lot about what we did and how we were successful. And what I would say, Carter, is that I divided things into kind of 3 categories. One is, what do you do before your trial starts? What you do during your trial conduct, and then what do you do after your trial? So before the trial even started, we spent a significant amount of time engaging with the sickle cell advocacy community, because we wanted their input into how to do the trial, and we wanted their buy-in that we were trusted partners. So we spent time going to meetings with advocacy groups, with community-based organizations, and the like, to make sure that before the trial we were getting input and building trust. During the trial conduct, and some of this we learned by spending time with the patients in advance, we heard about the real barriers to the patients being in our studies. And many of them were very simple, like patients in our communities don't always have cars. And sometimes they have to take mass transit to get to sites. So coming up with solutions to offer Uber rides and things like that work very well. Many of our patients also are in jobs where they can't take time off from work. So being flexible about scheduling hours for them on the weekends and the evenings was very important. And then finally, I would say on the investigator side, it's been well documented that investigators are less likely to offer clinical studies to people of color. So there needs to be some proactive education around investigators, less so in sickle cell disease, perhaps, but it's well documented that there's a lower rate of offering studies to people of color. So that needs to be something that's tackled. And then finally, one of the things that we also learned up front is that the patients really wanted to know the trial results. In fact, there was a lot of complaining that companies come in and do these studies and they never hear what happens at the end of the study. So us making a commitment that we were going to be there for the long run and communicate the results back to them was very important. So breaking into those 3 categories is kind of how I look at it in retrospect and going forward.
Thanks, Ted. And I think that really outlines what, the topics that we want to kind of dig into today. But let me first provide Stacy with the opportunity. I know that Janssen's been working to enhance diversity at the study level across all therapeutic areas. Can you tell us a little bit more about that work, what your team is, how you're leading that work, and give us some examples about how this is all coming to life?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to be here, and thank you, Carter, for the question. So, I always say, our diversity in clinical trials has been alive and well for many years within the Janssen organization. What we did in 2019 was just put together a structure that enabled it to soar across the organization and across our 6 therapeutic areas. I think of before 19, we had a working group model where, studies like our Lotus trial, where, that was the ground where we laid a lot of foundation around how we, recruit patients of color that had lupus and how we interact with the community, et cetera. But in 19, we put together a robust strategy that includes 3 pillars, and that's increasing access, really looking at awareness, clinical trial awareness, and then building trust within, the organization and the community about how they look at clinical trials. And since then, we've been on a mission, a relentless mission around all of our therapeutic areas, embedding that strategy. It looks different depending on the therapeutic area. But when it came to, things like COVID, it didn't come new to us, right? So we had that strategy in place. We knew what we needed to do and we executed. And I think that's also provided the foundation for what was next, which is at a company level, J&J has committed externally, millions of dollars to a Race to Health Equity Fund. And that's really looking at, across three pillars the three sectors that we have: consumer, medical devices, and farm, to say, how do we use our size for good and a diversity perspective, and not just from a clinical trial perspective, and that we're eradicating and looking at how do we, close that health disparities gap. So while it wasn't new, it provided a foundation, and we continue to kind of lay that foundation across our therapeutic areas to, a much broader conversation about health disparities and more specifically clinical trials.
Thanks, Stacey. And again, I apologize. We're still working to get Julie in here into the conversation. So hopefully we'll resolve that issue shortly. But, Ted, one thing that you mentioned, in the sort of pillars that you laid out, and that was sort of how you really started to think about this even before you started a clinical trial, right? That you really worked with the patient community to think about what the unique needs, or how to make sure that you're designing a trial that enables the participation that you want. One of the topics that Bio has been engaging in recently is really even thinking about, asking that same question, like what needs to happen very early on. How do you set about designing a trial? How should we be thinking about inclusion, exclusion criteria on the design of the trial? So can you maybe dig a little deeper into how you what information did you gather from that early engagement, and how did that impact how you designed your clinical trials?
Yeah, I can comment on a few things, but I think Stacey even touched on some of the stuff that I was thinking about, which is, it sounds like J&J is actually building relationships, building trusted relationships. And if we think about the distrust that many people of color have around clinical trials, and quite frankly, distrust of the whole healthcare system, we built this distrust over decades, and bringing it down is going to take a concerted effort over time. But getting back to your specific question, the patients wanted to know we were looking at things in our clinical study that really matter to them. They've been offered many clinical studies that are looking at things that they don't necessarily think has any value to them, or they don't understand the value to them. So maybe there is value to them, but they don't understand it. So for example, many studies have been done in sickle cell over the years looking at, fairly esoteric endpoints. The things that patients really care about, of course, are preservation of their organs, admission to hospital, their quality of life. They want to live a normal quality of life. So once we really began to explain to them, that's exactly what we're looking at. That's exactly what we're trying to deliver with our innovative therapies. That really gained more interest than going in telling them that we're going to look at a 6-minute walk test that they don't know how to put into context necessarily in terms of their outcomes.
So Stacey, does that resonate with you as well? I mean, I will say that on the panel preceding this, that was a point that some of the physician and community leaders raised, is that fundamental question of explaining the value and benefit to potential clinical trial participants and their families. Does that resonate with you as well?
Absolutely, right. So I think for sure, and Dr. Love spoke to kind of the history that we know with these communities of colors and the trust factor. And one of the things that I've seen and what we've seen across the Janssen portfolio is the way to get at the trust factor with communities is education and explanation. I long said, from before COVID, pre-COVID, in the vaccine development program that, I think across a number of us who've been in the space for a while, it was there is a hesitation amongst the communities of color to participate in clinical trials. But I also saw the reverse of that with the COVID development, the vaccine, and I think it was because across all the number of companies who were developing the vaccine, is we did a great job about education, right? We did a great job about just explaining. So we saw the benefit of that, and that people of color raised their hand, and then it became imperative of how do you pull them through. So I think that was a testament of what we thought, right, in the clinical trial process was, when you educate people around the process, you give them information, you commit to talking them through when the study is over, and do it in a way that they understand, that level of commitment and engagement at a patient level, therefore breeds within the community, because you have one person who says, I participated in a clinical trial, then becomes infectious, right? So I think that's absolutely the case in what we're seeing as we move forward, that we can get people in these clinical trials who are of color. It may look different, it may feel different, it may engage different, but this isn't no longer about, I don't think, a willingness. I think it's more about how are we willing to, as an industry, engage with them to make this come to life even more.
I think that's a great point, and you've both touched upon the really important aspect of like engagement, right? Early engagement, consistent engagement. As two leaders in the biotech industry, and knowing that you as individual companies are doing great work and taking strong commitments and acting upon those commitments, how should we be thinking about this as a whole ecosystem? I think one of the things we're trying to think through is, how do we build an engagement infrastructure that is constant and consistent? So, I'd be interested in your thoughts, like how should we be working together to really support the individual efforts to make an overall stronger effort, if that makes sense? Maybe I'll start with you, Ted, to respond to that.
Well, if I understand the question, what I would say is that I do think it is an ecosystem, as you said. We know that not only are people of color less likely to be offered clinical trials around innovative therapies, when those innovative therapies are approved, they're less likely to be offered them in the medical setting. And I do think these things go together. So if we can do a better job of really fixing this front end of building the trust, building the relationship, and quite frankly, building the understanding. One of the things that I would stress is that when we were going in to these sickle cell groups and Black church groups, et cetera, we weren't going in just to proselytize or tell them what we wanted them to hear from us. We were going in to listen. And in fact, I think listening is a key first step, because if you listen, number one, you will learn something. And number two, if you listen, people will walk away feeling heard. And that is a big, big step in building trust.
Stacey, is that your experience as well? Your thoughts as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just to pull on that thread around the ecosystem, I also think, just to take the industry, perspective, sitting on the sponsor side for a minute, I think that ecosystem also looks at, talking about diversity in clinical trials early, right? And that's really getting into the heart of how you eventually have this conversation on the back end with the community, is really looking at how do we engage with our clinicians and physicians who are designing these clinical trials early, really testing those, inclusion, exclusion criteria, and they're not being done or built or discussed or written in a vacuum, right? That we're really understanding the populations we intend to treat. Really looking at the operational piece, like where are we really trying to conduct this trial? Is it in the university centers we've always done? Or are we willing to look at a model that's different, that might include rural sites and trained sites, right? And then, like we talked about, what does that engagement look at a patient level? It has to be different. How are we using technology? How are we having conversations? How are we having individuals who are of color at site? So I do think it's an ecosystem. I've long said, it doesn't matter what Janssen does on its own, right, to develop this. Or I think as a collective industry, we got to hold hands, because there are, a patient's experience in a Janssen trial or a Biogen trial or a Merck trial, right, is really has to be consistent in terms of how we look at these particular patients and participants in trials. Because when we all win, we advance this, right? It can't be done in isolation.
Can I just add to something Stacey said? What Stacey said was we've got to be willing to flip the model for how we've done things, because as you know, Carter, as an industry, we're pretty conservative. we tend to want to do what has worked for us in the past.
Yeah, what's known.
And what's known. And what we've been doing has not been getting the diversity. Yet, if you're going to get the diversity, you've got to be willing to rethink the model. For example, you could tell the CRO that they're being accountable for diversity in the clinical trials. You could actually put some compensation metrics in there. Compensation works. If you tell people you're going to get paid differently, depending upon what the demographics of a study looks like, you could even do that internally with some of your employees. But it's some of the out of the box thinking that really, I think, can move the needle here, as Stacey suggested.
Well, I think that's such an important point, and I'm so glad that you're both raising it. And I was saying in the conversations that I've been having as well, that's the point. What we've been doing hasn't worked, so we have to do something different, right? And I think we're moving past a commitment to do something different, and we're actually seeing people think out of the box. So I think that's a really important point. And to that, maybe I want to circle back on the inclusion exclusion criteria, Stacey, that you raised. But before we get into that, another thing that happened, in the sort of lessons learned during the pandemic, we saw the deployment of approaches and tools that had to be done almost out of necessity. But I think really advanced our thinking about how we can look at the clinical trial network system, right? And how we can bring digital technologies into that. So one thing we're trying to, I think would be really enlightening for our audience is, how do you all, what should we be doing differently as we think about site selection? How can we, should we be doing more decentralized approaches, bringing more clinical trialists in from different facilities that represent and serve different patient populations? So I'd really like your thoughts, and Ted, you kind of began to touch on it, and just even how you approach your CRO. But I'd really like, maybe Stacey, if you want to I'll kick off with you. Like, how should we be doing site selection differently?
Yeah, so in what we've been trying to do and continue to do is just really use data science, right, as a way to anchor and how we look at site identification selection for our clinical trials. And I think if you have access to real world data, some of these data models that we've used it in our COVID trial. And what did that provide us? It provided us a way to say, okay, well, where is it specifically to the COVID vaccine? Is where was the incidence of the disease? Where are those communities of color, right? In what cities? Where is that? Those potential sites that we can target. So we flipped the model, like you said, out of necessity, and use data as the inflection. Well, the start and inflection point to have the conversation about your site base. Data alone doesn't get it done. I think you have to marry it with the operations piece of any organization to say, okay, if you need to go to Detroit, for example, do you have the infrastructure in Detroit and those investigators who understand and are committed to executing clinical trials? And if you don't, what does that investment look like, short or long term, about how you're going to willing to educate those physicians and turn them into clinical investigators. So I think that the combination with the data science, right, and really it gets us away from the traditional, like Dr. Love said, not always is it those, local those institutions we always go to. We're seeing data science open up the entire, in this instance for the US, the entire US, right, about where potential patients are. But when you marry that with operations, I think that's where the challenge was. And I think that's where the huge opportunity is moving forward, because it gets you out of the comfort zone of what our teams typically want to do. And that's, move fast and quick. And oftentimes, if you haven't thought about diversity in the beginning, then it becomes infinitely harder.
And, and Ted, some of the larger biopharmaceutical companies, they either do site selection themselves or they also use CROs. But given your experience and knowledge being a CEO of a smaller, more emerging company, what should we be communicating to CEOs of the smaller emerging companies? Again, is it the encouragement to think differently about how they engage with their CROs? Is that really a critical point here for the emerging company community?
I think it's critical. And Stacey, first of all, please call me Ted. No need to be formal with me. But no, I think you've got to lean in. And I was just thinking as I was listening to you, Stacey, that I trained at the Mass General. So when I first came to industry, I was always excited to offer clinical studies back to the Mass General. Well, there's not much diversity in that patient population. It's a big hospital, but there's not a lot of diversity. And if I wanted diversity, I might need to go to Grady or Detroit, as you mentioned. But many times when you go to some of those centers, they don't have resources to dedicate to clinical studies. Mm-hmm. So I learned that I need to be willing to invest in helping them build that infrastructure. If I invest, then that helps my study, but it also helps the next study that I might want to do. And it helps the study that you may want to do in the future, because some of these centers have been historically underinvested in. And so the problem is feeding itself. So we've got to go in and use some of our, not only our intentional efforts, but we've got to use some of our financial efforts.
Mm-hmm. Stacy, any additional comments to that?
No, I definitely agree. And I think we're aligned on, what Ted is saying, just around just the investment in how we're looking at it. One of the things that came to mind as he was talking is, we tend to, when we talk about diversity, we always, not always, but majority of the time, we always talk about race and ethnicity. And I think one of the things we're starting to have a conversation, or I am, across industry or in the company, of just around broaden that definition of race, right? So, and I think we also saw that, with our COVID and other programs that we signed, is that it is definitely race and ethnicity, right? But it's also age, it's also gender, and broadening that definition, having those conversations earlier. And it might be a combination, but I think some of the things that we need to start doing as an industry perspective is broaden that definition a bit, right? And we also know that what it looks like in the US is definitely going to be different than what it looks like ex-US for studies. We're on global studies, right? So starting to have this conversation around what does diversity mean outside the US? And then even in the US, broaden that definition to make sure that we're being inclusive to the study needs and to, all patients that we serve.
So I did want to circle back to the point, I think, Stacy, that you raised, and again, kind of thinking about at the very onset of how you design a clinical trial. And again, there were a lot of conversations that rose to the forefront during the pandemic, and that is the approach, how should we be approaching inclusion and exclusion criteria? And again, is the way that we've always done it too conservative and too prohibitive for many patient communities? So I'd be interested in both of your thoughts of, are you within your companies and with your scientists and medical professionals asking that question and really trying to think about what that should look like at the onset? And maybe Ted, I'll start with you, both with your own personal experience, both as a physician and an executive.
Well, in some ways, I may be the worst person to ask that question because sickle cell is primarily, at least in the U.S., a disease of African American descent. So clearly, our inclusion/exclusion criteria would not preferentially discard that community. But I would say it is possible to certainly design clinical studies that would disproportionately not bring certain patients. And I could think of several examples where you have diseases or conditions that are more common in certain communities or certain populations, and you really don't need to exclude it, and you exclude it. So for example, you could exclude a certain level of kidney dysfunction when it's not necessary, and that might be disproportionately screening out certain people. Hypertension, diabetes, maybe even body surface area, body weight. And so I think we do have to look at criteria, but I also think the operational things that Stacy pointed out, those are probably even bigger, I would suspect.
Yeah, it is. On the operation side, it definitely is, right? I mean, I think this is that whole notion of having to start early, right? And I think, having those conversations with our clinicians as they're designing the clinical trial. And I don't think anybody intends, obviously, to write inclusion and exclusion criteria that are very prohibitive. But I also think sometimes having the conversation for them to understand what that might mean to communities of color and how that might impact the study, right? And be able to make those adjustments and have that real-time conversation of potential impact to the trial can make the difference. Has it always, do we all see wholesale change across our entire portfolio? No, right? Like, let's just be, clear and honest about some of the challenges. But I do think having the conversation is a start. It's foundational, right? And I think what has also made the difference in our organization is the organizational commitment for diversity and inclusion in clinical trials. Right. So everyone knows that, those designing the study protocols all the way down to those who are in clinical operations knows that this is a strategic imperative for the organization. So that helps to enable some of those folks who are traditionally set in wanting to design these inclusionized criteria, because now they're forced to also have that diversity discussion, because, folks on my team are there as well with the operations team to keep it at the forefront of, yes, we want to make sure that we're designing trials that are inclusive.
Stacey, I do have one idea that I think does get to inclusion exclusion criteria, because sometimes I think it's written, but oftentimes it's not written, but I think it's implied. So the exclusion that the patient, it may not be willing to be compliant, or there's an expectation that the patient needs to be somebody who will be compliant during the study conduct. I guarantee you that judgment does not get applied evenly. And giving that subjectivity to the investigator, I think, is a license to disproportionately under-enroll certain groups. And I think you've got to do the opposite. I think you've got to be letting investigators know that we know that there's a problem with not offering studies to diverse populations.
Yeah.
And we fully expect you to be doing that. So
right.
I think we need to make sure that's not an exclusion criteria. If it is, it's got to be very explicit and not subject to interpretation the way it could be vaguely interpreted.
Yeah. And I think, again, just another radical out there, to build on what is just, looking at the selection process of investigators and how we incentivize investigators and how we pay investigator fees, right? And I'm not saying that by any means do you say you're only going to get paid if you, enroll diverse participants, but, actually looking at, the commitment the organization have and making sure the understanding as investigators sign up for trials and participate in trials, that diversity is important. And the metrics that they offer and the patients that they, that they enroll in the trial is also going to be a part of looking at the diversity of those patients that they bring in and having a routine conversation with them, just like we would talk about, the results or the enrollment or the logs or whatever it is. We're also going to have a conversation about diversity. And that's something that we're building into our operational model. So it's that accountability. And how do you incentivize and hold sites accountable for also bringing in diversity as well? Because it can't just be us as a sponsor having a great idea and making this priority. We need a partner with the sites to make sure they actually pull those patients through.
So, what in some of the conversations that I've been in, I would say 5 years ago versus now. And I will say that I am very optimistic that the conversation we're having around clinical diversity today feels very different. It feels very action oriented. And, I think one of the topics that I often heard in the 5 years ago conversation was, it's not always possible to power clinical trials to evaluate health outcomes across all patient populations. And that seemed to be, and again, this may not apply in like a sickle cell disease, situation, Ted, but that was sort of what was identified as maybe a common barriers to why we weren't seeing diversity. And so some of the recent conversations I've been having with other leaders in the clinical development ecosystem is let's make sure that we understand that there are two goals. They're related, but neither one should prohibit movement on the other. And what I mean by that is the desire to create an inclusive clinical development ecosystem, full stop. And then the second goal, related but separate, and that is how do we improve our ability to understand health outcomes across all patient populations. So in my mind, I think that has become quite clear in the conversations we're having that we do need to sort of make that distinct. Is that a fair point? Do you all agree with that? And how do you interpret those two things?
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I mean, I would definitely agree. Stacey, I was going to add one. I'm going to shut up and let you talk first, though.
I definitely think, I often say in the clinical trial ecosystem, we can create this diverse pool of patients. We have, our goals, our diversity goals around clinical trials, and we have that, that the robust pool of data available across, demographics. But on the flip side of that, with a commercial organization in medical affairs, it has to pull through. It has to carry through. It doesn't matter what we do in that clinical trial environment if that doesn't translate in the commercial medical affairs environment to be able to get at those overall health outcomes, right? And really looking at how do we close the health disparity gap. So we can generate all the data, we can get the insights, but if that pull through doesn't happen, I'm not saying it's for naught, but it has to be a smooth handover in how we look at disease and disease areas and disease states, and from the clinical trial environment to the commercial and medical, access on that side as well.
Yeah. So, Stacey, I was going to say before, you gave me an idea when you were talking about incentives. And one of the things that we often incentivize investigators around is enrollment. And the highest enrollers often get best positions on the paper. We could do the same thing with diversity. We could say the sites which help us most in our efforts to get diversity are guaranteed, a position on the publication. I think that'd be very easy
Absolutely.
for us to think about implementing.
Yeah, and I think we have a good example of that. Sorry, just in the COVID trial, what we found too is in our vaccine program is we had a diversity dashboard. And it's amazing how investigators who participate in the clinical trial, the competitiveness of being 5th or 10th. And it's a small thing, right? It's just looking at your metrics, but, everybody wants to contribute. So we saw movement. And can you imagine what you could do with that, right? And just in terms of communicating, sharing, incentivizing in a way that, is good for all. So I think, any idea around that and continuing that effort and that spirit, it is doable.
Yeah. I would say creating competition is incentivizing for a lot of people like us, particularly. But just on your point about about subgroup analysis, I would just emphasize, I think it is important to be able to, at the end of a study, to at least be able to look at subgroups to observe if there's a consistency of effect. Obviously, you're not going to be powered for every subgroup, but I do think it is important to be able to look for a consistency of effect. And one of the things that we know, for example, very well, is that antihypertensive drugs that we've developed over the years have very differential effect based upon ethnic groups. Maybe the Starcase example is a drug that was developed for heart failure called Bideal. And that study happened to be done in the VA system. And so they had a significant number of African Americans in the study. And they actually found a very strong signal in that subpopulation. And ultimately, the drug was approved for African Americans. So there is benefit to, in fact, making sure you have diversity in your study so that you can either pick up a benefit that may be unique in that population, or more worrisome, pick up a harm or a lack of efficacy in that population that should really guide you to be promoting the drug or approving the drug in a different way.
So, the goal of this summit is to focus on clinical trial diversity. So again, reaching those goals that you've both been laying out of what we want to have happen before a drug is approved, and to make sure that we, have those insights and understandings, Ted, at least have the ability to capture that information. But while we're on the topic, should we also be thinking about how to ensure that we have a continued learning, post approval? What are your all's thoughts on how we maybe use real world evidence or continued ability to update FDA snapshots, to provide knowledge as it comes in and grows, if that makes sense. So any comments to that? line of thinking, Stacy or Ted?
I think you're definitely, something where you continue. And I think, Carter, what it gets at is transparency, right? Being able to, on the back end with the approval and interaction and community engagement, but the transparency, I think, post-approval is something that will definitely make a difference, right? In these communities and how they look at clinical trials. So I think it's imperative that we, continue to have that conversation. We figure out how do we do that in a very, transparent way across this business that we call clinical trials.
Yeah, I think transparency is so important, and transparency is critical to building trust. It's critical to building trust with regulatory agencies around the world, but it's also critical in building the trust in these communities. And quite frankly, if we want to sell our therapies in certain communities, we need to be confident that those communities are getting benefit. And we need to be confident that those communities are prepared to embrace the products that we're bringing them so that they do get the benefit that they may even disproportionately enjoy.
And Ted, I've heard you say on more than one occasion, that we have to remind ourselves that patients already have enough skin in the game, dealing with their disease. And I've never forgotten it, and I steal it often. But, as sort of taking that line of thinking, how should we be thinking about, and how did you, with your clinical trial designs, work to sort of minimize those additional burdens that may differentially impact certain individuals from participating in clinical trials?
Yeah, I mean, actually, you brought up one of my pet topics, and I'll just for everyone's background, I say that line usually when it's about copays. I hate copays because I think at the end of the day, all they're doing is discouraging people from taking the therapies that we've worked so hard to develop to help them. So I think copays are a terrible thing, and I would love to see them go away entirely. But to your point, I actually also think over engineering clinical studies is regressive in terms of diversity of clinical studies. If you ask someone like me to make an unnecessary visit, then it's less disruptive because I can afford to do it. I can take time off from work. But let's say that I work at McDonald's and I make minimum wage. Every unnecessary visit you put into that study is more likely to make me not participate in the study. Every extra hoop you make me jump through. So I think we do have to minimize our clinical studies. And I think we've learned that a little bit during COVID. Let's focus on what really matters. And let's stop collecting a bunch of data and doing a lot of visits that really don't substantially add to the clinical study.
I wholeheartedly agree. And I think, one of the things I'm excited about, in being in a post-COVID world is I think, COVID has taught us a lot of things about how you can use digital, right? How you can use telehealth, how you can do a centralized care model and maybe think of a Walgreens or a CVS. And, I think it's opened a world of, really, again, looking at how do we conduct clinical trials and how can we turn it on its head to meet people where they are, right? And where they are is local, where they are is in their trusted community, where they are is, in community centers or with a trusted individual who, my goodness, if we can educate that individual, right? And so I think it's really about looking at the model and using all the things that we kind of put our toe in the water from a post-COVID perspective or even during COVID around using digital in the ways of, treating patients. And it's not about coming to, a site, a physical site sometimes 10 or 15 times. Do you think about some of these studies that go on for years? It's, I just think that burden has to be continually discussed with our teams and those designing the trials to say this is not going to be realistic in certain communities and here's why, but not come to the table with why it won't work, but also come with solutions that also allows them to feel comfortable that they're designing a trial that's going to work, right? Because that's where, they're interested in from a scientific perspective.
So I'm so glad you brought up the points around digital and sort of telehealth technologies, right? And that in and of itself kind of could help us think more broadly geographically across the country. It could also help us think more broadly geographically across a single city, in terms of engaging clinical trialists as well as patients, right? One thing, we've been talking with myself and some of my colleagues at Bio have been talking with patient groups, one question that comes up sometimes is, how do we make sure we're not creating a digital divide? So, Stacy, when you talk about, how is Janssen sort of approaching the supplying of that technology, and or ensuring people have access to that kind of technology to make sure, again, that we're not creating another barrier inadvertently.
Yeah, I think that's a fair question, and I'll be open and real and say we haven't really fully figured that out yet,
Yep.
right? In terms
Yeah,
of,
well, it's all new, right? Everything's evolving very quickly, so yeah.
but I think that's a fair point. Like, we always make assumptions, right? That everyone has internet. We always computer, right? Those things that we know don't always happen in these communities. So I think it's a fair point. I think it's something we're really trying to figure out with our partners, and how do we close that digital divide, and how do we ensure that we take advantage of technology where we can. But I think it also, again, this is where I don't think we can do it alone. I think this is where the power of the industry comes together, and commitment around diversity and meeting patients or participants where they are, and how do we do that, right? And that will take an investment by all, not just a couple.
So
Yeah, I think we've
Ted.
got to learn. I think we've got to learn from things that aren't working, and we have to iterate even while we're doing our clinical studies. And actually, COVID is a very good example with the vaccine distribution. I think one of the things we learned is that the mere requirement that there be an appointment was created a divide, because there were certain people, like construction workers, who could not schedule time off from work. And so having a system where people didn't have to get on a computer, didn't have to schedule time off, was less stress. In Washington, D.C., even if they put the vaccine center in a Black neighborhood, they found that it was all white patients in that Black neighborhood getting the vaccine, because they were beating the patients to the internet. They were more capable of being flexible about their schedules to get appointments. And we had to learn from that.
Yeah, and I just got incoming notice. Unfortunately, Julie Gerberdine, we've not been able to resolve a technical difficulty, so she won't be able to join us, which is quite unfortunate. As we all know, Julie is an excellent leader in this area, and in the industry writ large. So I just want to take a moment just to highlight, to tell our audience, check out Merck's website. They actually have a great information page on what they are doing to improve clinical trial diversity. They've laid out, they have a mission statement saying that the importance of including minority community is critical across all levels of clinical research. They have listed 5 steps that they are taking to advance diversity. So I just wanted to make sure that I provided that. If somebody could maybe put a link in the chat, just to, again, since it's unfortunate we can't resolve the technical issues, I can at least share with the audience what Merck is doing as an example, again, of another company who is not just committing to an ideal, but setting strategies and taking action. So again, we apologize to Julie, but just wanted to make that available to our audience. So circling back, Ted and Stacy, with you all, maybe using that as another jumping off point. Another thing we saw during the COVID pandemic was collaboration on a scale we've never seen before. And that collaboration was from company to company. It was from company to regulator, from regulator to academic researchers. I mean, the whole, the challenge was there, and the whole system had to come together to resolve the challenge, which we're starting to see the results, the fruits of that labor in real time now. So as we think about this clinical trial diversity, Stacey, you've mentioned a couple of times during this conversation that we need to hold hands, right? So what is that, how should we be thinking about company to company information sharing? Again, I see that the spirit is alive and well. Is that something we need to sort of harness, embrace, encourage? I think this summit is an example. This is one example, but I'd really like to hear your thoughts about how do we really need to approach that collaboration moving forward.
Yeah, I think, again, coming out of the pandemic, I'm excited about the possibilities because look at what we did, right? Look at the development time that occurred. I think if we were left to our own devices, right, that would have been years. Now, I'm not saying by any means that every study should look, or we should design or operate at, a warp speed, for our entire portfolio, but I can tell you just operationally, like the things that, I saw and we did, and I've seen other sponsors talk to, my peers and other companies, what took sometimes months to do, we did in days, right? So I think the possibility, we showed ourselves as an industry what can be done when we work together, when we collaborate, when we get out of our own way, right, in all of our processes. And we're committed to doing something that changes, humanity in this instance. Is powerful. So if we can agree to hold hands post-pandemic and keep on the trajectory, my goodness, what we can do for this world in terms of, therapies and I think that spans the gamut, right? I think, again, coming out of COVID, I think there's a lot of opportunity, but it's up to us to seize it.
I love your line, get out of our own way. I've said that many times over my career, because I think it is oftentimes our processes, our procedures that we put into place well-meaning, but sometimes they just accumulate and they're not even relevant for what needs to be decided at the time. I would say that a framework, Carter, that I've always tried to use when it comes to figuring out how we do things faster and better, or whether it's collaborate with another company that might even be considered a competitor. I think the way to think this through is what is right for the patient. We really try to make sure the patient is our North Star and that we're focusing on the North Star. And if you do that, you can actually often do a better job of getting out of your own way, I've found.
That's a great point. It's a great point. Well, I know that we've got some questions from the audience, so why don't I turn to those here real quick? Let's see. The first question is, how do we balance the need to explain the value of endpoints and benefits of trials while still meeting the obligations to communicate that this is research, that experimental therapies don't always work? So who'd like to take that first? Ted? Stacey, yeah, okay, Stacey, go ahead, yeah.
I was going to say I'll default to Ted to go ahead.
So what I would say is that, Stacey said the word transparency, but you need to speak in ways that people understand. I think one of the things that we often do is speak to people in terms and in language and in manners that are not inviting them in. So I think first we got to get our language right, and we've got to listen, and we've got to make sure that we're communicating in a way that's responsive to what we've heard. I don't think that sickle cell patients expect every therapy to work. I think they know that we are trying to innovate. And in fact, I think it's important, if you're really going to build trust in them, to let them know that we are hopeful, but the reason we're doing this study is to know the answer. And the reason we want you to participate is this could potentially benefit you, but ultimately it could benefit many, many, many people, but we don't know until we get the work done.
Yeah, I would agree. Just, I think, Ted talked to just about the word selection, right? It is important, right? And then I think if we get away from things that we hear sometimes anecdotally, like guinea pig, and, not that everyone kind of refers to clinical trials in that way, but I think if we flip the language on its head and say, this is about innovation, right? This is really about, creating the new therapy in this particular, therapeutic area or this arm of the study, and being able to talk to them about the innovation and how they're helping. I think that change in how we portray clinical trials could can help tremendously. And being able to explain the side of the testing model versus, and the fact that not all things work, but that next one might, right? And that's where the innovation and the language change could help, right? And how people see clinical trials. So that would just be my suggestion.
So before I go to the next question, let's pull on that thread just a little bit, because I think what you're saying is, again, it's even how we're communicating is fundamental to making sure that you're reaching different communities that may receive and understand information differently, right? And so when you guys are thinking about your interactions and development of educational materials and working with patient and community leaders, is that something you'd advise that every leader, in a biopharmaceutical company take seriously and really think about very early on? Is that one of the things we want to convey to our entire industry, is that needs to be thought through, and again, from a listening perspective and then an execution perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that as we walk through our strategy, we heard from the communities, don't come to us when you want something, right? Don't come to us when you absolutely have to, you need me, whether it's a church organization, whether it's an association, or whether it's a patient or participant. Come to me as a whole, right, across all of your therapies, and educate me. So we created what we call Research Includes Me, which is our external facing site that just talks about participating in clinical trials in general, agnostic of therapy, agnostic of, the clinical trial itself. And I think that's our way to say, we're here for the long haul, right? We're not here because we have a vaccine or we have this therapy or we have this drug. We're here coming whole and wanting to educate the community in general about the clinical trial process. If every other company does that, that will shape how, people look at the pharmaceutical and biotech industry from a clinical trial perspective and development from my perspective.
Yeah, and I'll just add it, and obviously it's not just the clinical studies. We're fortunate that our sickle cell therapy is approved and it's on the market. So we're spending a lot of time trying to make sure that we are getting to the patient and that the message is tested to resonate in the community that we're talking to. That the way we explain things is communicated in a way that resonates in our community. The way we buy access to media to get our message out there is really going to the right community. Because I think many times, and I think Stacey said this, we assume that what we're doing is getting to everyone, when in fact, it may be completely missing people. And that's why they're not showing up for our clinical studies or showing up, quite frankly, for our therapies when they're on the market.
Yeah. But I think it's important too, if you think about the generations behind us, right, and how they consume information, it doesn't look the same as the way that, at least for me.
Yeah, I grew up without a cell phone, yes.
Just the whole TikTok and Facebook and all these other things that, I conceivably, don't necessarily understand all the time, but the generations behind us, it will be a totally different way of how they consume information. So for me, it becomes equally important on the messaging and how we, reach the generations behind us and in front of us who consume differently than we did. So how are we bridging that gap? How are we talking about it? What language are we using? Are we getting agencies to support us who understand that things that we don't understand? I mean, I think it's causing an interesting conversation about, again, how do you reach people where they are in the language that they understand?
That's a really good point. I can certainly speak to the generational aspect. My 8-year-old nephew knows how to work a phone better than I do, right? So we got another great question, and I'm so glad that this was raised, and that is, can you talk more about why this makes business sense? And that was in the title of the panel, so I'm so glad somebody brought it. So, can you talk about why it makes business sense to include a diverse population? We all know that it's the right thing to do, but why is it the smart thing to do? I think is the essence of the question. So who'd like to take that question? And Ted, I know with sickle cell, this may be a bit unique. We'll ask you to put your bio chair hat on and really speak for the community here. So Ted?
Well, I mean, I would say that it makes business sense because we are about helping people. And we are about avoiding hurting people with our therapies. And for us to do that well, we really need to know the information. Number two, we want to ultimately have our products adopted in every community if and when it's approved. And doing the work up front of engaging those communities in our clinical studies will pay dividends in terms of the uptake of the product in that community. Basically, it's good. I mean, it's good that we understand the benefit risk of our product in every community, that every community is aware of our product if and when our product becomes available. And then also you avoid surprises. I mean, for example, let's say that you have a therapy for hypertension and you only had 1% African Americans in your study, and the drug really doesn't work in African Americans. You're going to find that out, but you're going to find that out in a negative way, probably. Or let's say it has as a risk that you don't know about. You're going to find it out. So I think it makes enormous business sense, but it is also the right thing to do. And in our business, I would say those things are almost always the same thing. The right thing to do and what makes business sense. And I'm always shocked that people don't make that connection.
Yeah, same, right? So I think we're in the business to develop therapies that treat all, right? And so, and I think the demographics of the U.S., if we're only talking through a U.S. lens, are changing, right? So how do we continue to do that and not have business models that ensure that we're testing and developing through that lens? So for me, it makes good business sense because it makes good societal sense because it's just good drug development, right? And therapeutic development. So I agree. I think it's not an option. I think it's just, for me, at least through my lens, again, not speaking for everybody, but how, for me, I turn it around and say, how doesn't this make good business sense, right? I think we should have been having this conversation and doing this long ago.
Well, I really appreciate the audience member that posed that question, so that you are able to convey that very clearly to the audience. Another question that we have in the Q&A box is, let's see, in the USA, are there clinical trial sites in minority or poor communities? And is there an appetite to set up clinical trial sites in those communities? And this is a question coming from somebody who is writing in from Johannesburg in South Africa. So I think that is it's an interesting question. So who would like to answer that? So
if I understand it, are there sites in localized communities?
Yeah, let me see if I can reinterpret the question here a little bit. I think what they're asking is, again, kind of going back to that site selection, perhaps question, how are we going about to make sure that there's not that the economics of a community are not a driving factor for or against providing, a clinical trial site,
And I think, at least through my lens, this is where that data science agnostic model comes in that can help, take that bias out, right? Because you're really looking at a specific data set that allows you to zero in on rate of incidence, demographic, anything that you're trying to identify. And then it becomes, the operational lens of, and commitment to build out those localized community centers or partner, right, with other localized investigators to train them to become clinical investigators and do localized clinical research.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think it is fair to assume that there has been disproportionate underinvestment in certain communities where we historically have challenges recruiting. And I'll give one example. There are a lot of sickle cell patients cared for at Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta. And every time I've tried to get patients from there, what I've learned, but we're fixing this, is that they are so underfunded that they've never had the luxury of building a clinical trial infrastructure. They can barely keep their head above water just providing the clinical care. So someone like me, and we did, go down and say, okay, we're going to fund something to help you build that infrastructure. And you can use that infrastructure for any trial in the world, not just our studies. So I think it's fair to assume that there has been underinvestment, and the solution is not saying, well, Grady can't be a site. The solution is to create a site where nobody's created it. Mass General wasn't a site until somebody put money in to create it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think an innovative way to think about that moving forward is, what about it as an industry if we pull ourselves together and Grady becomes a site for clinical trials, period, not just for Janssen trials, not just for, specific sponsored trials, right? And I think everyone's been saying, how can we help? How can we pull together? And I think, again, looking at the models and turning them upside down a bit and being focused on meeting participant patients where they are. And if we're all willing to do that from an industry perspective, and we're all willing to put skin in the game and funding to be able to do that, given that example that you just gave, Ted, how could that be transformational, right? That's really looking at it in a different lens to say it's not my trial, right? It's an industry trial. And that gets into a very dicey conversation around competition. But I think it's a holistic way to look at how do we invest in communities for the long term.
That's great. Great point.
Well, and I find it really fascinating because, again, one of the words, and again, I think it's in some of the titles of our panels and our summit today, and that is like really trying to look at this from an infrastructure lens, right? So that you still have healthy competition, but how do we just build an infrastructure that's more expansive? And maybe, Ted, that's a great example of how we think through that infrastructure. And then, as you say, Stacey, how do we, encourage sharing of that information so people realize that an expanded infrastructure helps us all, and we can still be, competition is alive and well, but infrastructure will help all boats rise. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So let's see here. I'm just looking at the questions. So one sort of along the same lines of something that's arisen is you may have like a clinical trial site, at a Johns Hopkins, that serves one patient population, but there's no connectivity maybe to a hospital that's, across the street that is maybe the primary care facility for underrepresented communities that you're actually trying to reach. Do we, as we talk about thinking differently, should we be thinking differently about, do you need a whole clinical trial site, traditionally set up with all the bells and whistles, just to speak in color commentary here, versus maybe these decentralized trials approach where you have clinical trialists that are, allowed to participate as a trialist in that, in a clinical trial, but maybe not have not as an expansive setup required for where they actually work. I may have rambled that question a little too much, but see if you can work through it and provide some insights. Yeah.
My personal opinion is I think decentralized trials is definitely here to stay and a way to go, right? But I think operationally we need to figure out some of the bigger things is, what does it look like from a regulatory filing perspective? What does it look like from a quality perspective? All the things that us in the operational, realm of conducting clinical trials need to think about. How does that pull through a decentralized model look like? Again, we're used to a very structured way of looking at clinical trials, and a decentralized model, I just think we need to think about the pull through, right, of those models and the design and making sure we're still maintaining the quality, we're making sure we're still getting to the regulatory filings, et cetera, with that model. But I also think it's a model that's beneficial for our intent and not to keep going back to the original intent, but the intention is to meet people where they are. And that's going to look different than what we've done in the past. So therefore, we have to make sure the operational model to support decentralized trials is equally as robust as what we had before. And there's still some work to do.
Totally agree. And we've been doing more and more of that, working with non-traditional sites who really have built relationships. I have great respect for Johns Hopkins. I even thought about doing part of my training there. But many people see Johns Hopkins as where Henrietta Lacks happened. And if you do a study at Johns Hopkins, you just need to be very clear that you're going to get people in that surrounding community in your clinical study. And you got to look at the data and see if that's the center that's really going to get you those patients or get you those subjects for your clinical study, or if it's some other, a more decentralized way to get those patients. There's no judgment on Hopkins one way or the other. And I apologize even for using them as an example, because I think this could apply to many, many hospitals. But the truth is, what you think may be that site's capacity to bring in diverse clinical studies may not be the reality, and you need to know the reality before you run out and go for a big prominent name.
So maybe I'll make a plug for two panels that we've got tomorrow as part of the summit. Is we actually are going to be talking to a lot of the CROs as well as companies that have data capture platforms that really get to that identifying. I think Stacey, what you're talking about, sort of those agnostic, be able to find patients, and then some new ways in which the CROs are thinking about conducting clinical trials to achieve the sort of inclusivity and representative goals. And we also have a panel tomorrow that talks about the community engagement, where we'll be talking to patient groups, community leaders, to really think through how we need to partner and work with those organizations in a systemic and sustained way moving forward. So we've only got just a couple more minutes, so maybe we'll just do a quick round robin. One, I've loved this discussion, so I hope the audience has loved it as much as I have. But I'll sort of end with the question of, let's say we're on a panel 5 years from now. What do you hope that we're actually going to be able to say 5 years from now? And maybe I'll start with you, Stacey, and then we'll close with you, Ted.
Yeah, so I've long said, I would hope, and, we're engaged and we're talking about other things on the panel, and I welcome the invite, but I hope we're not talking about diversity in clinical trials, because I've long said that, listen, those of us who've been in this business for a while, we remember paper CRFs, right? We remember attempt tails, remember those binders that we called our TMF, but we don't talk about that anymore, right? Those are long gone. And I think the example here is, if we do what we're supposed to do, we put the focus on it, we're not talking about diversity anymore in our clinical trials, because it's become an inclusive environment. So for me, while I would love to be, again, engaging you all 5 years later, but hopefully we're talking about something else. We're talking about some other innovation, because we've done what we've committed to do today to make this to a point where it's not about diversity specifically, because we're designing inclusive and conducting inclusive and representative clinical trials, just a way of standard business.
I think Stacey said it perfectly. I'm thrilled that we're talking about this today, because I think the key to solving a problem is acknowledging it exists first. And then once you acknowledge it exists, you put programs and actions and investment to solve the problem. So as Stacey said, I'm hoping in 5 years, we will have done that. And we'll be looking at clinical studies that really do reflect the patient population that our drug is intended to serve.
Well, I love that answer. And I will say on behalf of our CEO, Dr. Michelle McMurray-Heath, that is, we as a trade organization, that's the goal that we are striving for, is to have this not be a topic in the future, but rather just a way of doing things. So I really appreciated that. I will say, before we just officially close the session, there were several great questions in the Q&A we did not have time to get to, but we, bio staff, are collecting those questions, and we will make sure to continue to bring them forward to our board and committee activities. So those questions will not be lost. We will carry them forward in our work here at Bio. So with that, thank you, Stacey. Thank you, Ted. Again, apologies that Julie was not able to join us, but I've thought this was a great conversation, and really appreciate you giving us your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carter. Thank you, Stacey.